Okay, we have a distinguished speaker today. First of all, Mark Kendall is the one who arranged this topic. He unfortunately can't be here today, so he asked me to kind of introduce the speaker. Mark and I had worked together for 25 years at the Department of Energy and interfaced on some climate change issues as well. So he had arranged this speaker, so I want to make sure he gets credit for having done that. And Mark, of course, Mark this year, of course, is the president of the Oregon League of Voters, which is the connection to today's speaker. So Robin Tokmakian, okay, is today's speaker. She represents the League of Women Voters, the United States, as a member of the Observer Corps to the United Nations with an emphasis on climate issues beginning in 2017. Her primary work is to monitor UN activities of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Secretariat based in Bonn, Germany. Part of her responsibilities is to organize observer delegates to the annual Conference of Parties that takes place on climate change. It's the primary venue for negotiating the implementation of the Paris Agreement. That was signed in 2016, I think. Her League of Women Voters participation has included being president of the League of Women Voters for Monterey County, California, and League of Women Voters California board member, and a member of the League of Women Voters U.S. Task Forces on International Trade and Climate Change. She's currently a member of the League of Women Voters in Portland. She's telling me she moved up to the Portland area about 6 years ago. Dr. Tokmakian has a BA in physics, a master's in oceanography, and her doctorate in physical oceanography. And by profession, she is a physical oceanographer with experience in both teaching and research in the areas of global ocean and climate modeling, remote sensing of the oceans, and model uncertainty. Dr. Tokmakian.
Thank you for inviting me to this and your interest in both the League of Women Voters and the UN. I'm delighted to share this information with you all. So a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to first give you a little bit of background about why the League is involved with the UN. It's kind of an odd thing that we're involved in. The history then of the UN's climate work and how that all came about. And then the description of how these climate entities at the UN work. I'll also then talk about the functions of the organizations and the outcomes of the work that occurs at these two climate entities. And then last, I'll talk about the current state affairs of the UN work on climate, in particular, how this work is affected by the U.S. not participating in that effort for international cooperation. So the League of Women Voters, as many of you know, is a nonpartisan grassroots civic organization. It encourages understanding major policy issues. It tries to influence public policy issues through education and advocacy. Primarily, we're a voting rights organization, and we're working very hard at the national level and state levels to help keep our voting rights and make sure that everyone can equally participate. But we also have advocacy roles across a broad range of other topics: healthcare, housing, climate, natural resources, etc. And we've been in existence for over 100 years, forming in 1920, after the women got the right to vote. So the League is one of the oldest and most respected of the nonprofit organizations doing this kind of civic work. So how did we get involved with the UN in the first place? Well, in 1945, when the UN was first talked about, President Truman came to the League, mostly because Eleanor Roosevelt was also involved in the League, and asked for the League's help in advocating for the creation of the United Nations. So we went around the country with our grassroots membership and encouraged people to support the creation of the UN for that year, and then we all know that it was created. So in the following year, the League was helped to also establish the Commission on the Status of Women. So the second year of the UN, a commission was set up specifically to address women's issues, and it's now known as UN Women. In 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the League's advocacy chair, was also chairing the UN's Human Rights Declaration Committee, so the committee that developed the Human Rights Declaration. So that's a very important role that the League was playing in developing that Human Rights Declaration, which is used as a basis for most, if not all, of the UN's work today. More recently, the League was involved in advocating for the inclusion of girls, specifically in the human rights work. And then the League also helped found the UNICEF's Working Group on Girls, and was one of the founders for the International Day of the Girl. Currently, there are 5 of us who are UN observers. Everyone except me are located on the East Coast. Dr. Moda is in Vermont, and the rest are in the New Jersey, New York City area. So they can attend a lot of the opportunities that come up at the UN headquarters. The issues that we cover currently are things like human trafficking. There's a lot of work being done on the international level for human trafficking. We're also quite involved with the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. And the leagues around the country are working to try to get cities in the U.S. to sign up to this convention and support the convention, because the U.S. government has been very reluctant to sign on to that agreement. And then we're also involved since the beginning in the UN Women's efforts. And every year the UN Women hold a conference in New York City with a lot of side events focused on women's issues. And we have side events ourselves for that. So I know you can't read this slide, and it wasn't meant for you to read, but I wanted to just put it up there to emphasize the large bureaucratic organization that is the UN. When I first started this work, I wasn't really aware that the breadth of things that covered the UN and the organization that I was familiar with, for example, the World Meteorology Organization, actually also falls under the UN system. And some of the international ocean organizations that I was also familiar with fall under the UN system. But primarily the UN, it has these, on the left side of this chart are these 5 major organs, what they call organs. We have the General Assembly, and then the Security Council, and then the Economic and Social Commission, or they call it ESOSOC. The UN likes a lot of acronyms, so it takes sometimes a long time to learn these acronyms. So different bits of the UN are responsible for different things. And the League observing takes place within the General Assembly and also the Economic and Social Council. We have a permanent accreditation with the Economic and Social Council, and that allows us to have the ability to make statements, help influence policies easily in the areas that they're working on. So it was through this accreditation that the League also can then observe and get formal recognition at the areas that are covered by the climate. So in the under the General Assembly, there's certain things that fall under that. I think that UNICEF is under that. And you can see that there's a list of various sub things that are under the General Assembly, including UN Women. And then in the Economic and Social Council area, the things that are under that, the UN's environmental program are under that, and then the World Meteorology Organization falls under that. The International Labor Union falls under that. So the League is also not ever really involved in what the Security Council does. I'm not sure if we ever have written an advocacy letter to the U.S. ambassador supporting something for the Security Council. But we have written advocacy letters to the General Assembly and also the Economic Council. The area in yellow down below is the Secretariat, and that's the administration of the UN itself. And I think that's all I'll mention on this slide. So the UN has what's called the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's a blueprint to help guide the UN on their activities. They address a lot of global challenges and for example, reduce poverty by the year 2030. It's going to be a challenge. To address climate change, address peace. And so there's these 17 goals. Climate action is one of them, but climate issues in the climate change area also fall under having a sustainable energy system. It also has sustainable cities falls under that. So a lot of the areas, being healthy falls under climate. So even though there's a specific one for climate action, most of the other sustainable development goals are also important in the climate area. So I'm going to go on to the history of the climate work that occurs at the UN. So in 1988, there was a resolution that was proposed by the country of Malta to prepare a review and recommendations about the science of climate change. And this occurred because if you go back to that time, we were talking about the ozone hole in the atmosphere and how the UN had made sure internationally we were addressing that. There was a large drought in Sudan, and that also drove this. And so this resolution was prepared and voted upon and approved unanimously by the General Assembly in 1988. And as a result of that, what's called the International Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, was created. So this panel, that's made up of a set of international participants, is managed by both the World Meteorology Organization and the UN's Environment Program. So the World Meteorology Organization is an organization that manages the weather agencies around the world. So they're an organization that will manage the sharing of data across different countries so that the US's weather agency can use the data from satellites that are run by the European Union. They also will manage the sharing of the outputs of weather models so that agencies around the world can improve their own weather models. They hold conferences, get the scientists together to discuss meteorology types of science. And then they also will or manage various scientific experiments. They'll get the scientists involved to run these experiments that are international. So they not only worry about the atmosphere, they also will manage oceanography types of experiments also, and the sharing of data from the ocean, because there's a tight couple between the two. And then the UN's Environment Program manages the logistics and things like that of the International Panel on Climate Change. So this panel created this first review and then provided the information to the General Assembly. And out of that, in 1992, came the treaty, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, or commonly known as UNFCCC. And it was initiated under a conference on the environment and development in 1992. So initially there was 154 countries who signed on to the treaty. And in 1992, George H.W. Bush signed the treaty, and the Senate ratified it. So it was unanimous by the Senate, by the way. And then currently, there's 198 parties to the treaty, 197 member states, and then the EU. So that comes to 198. So what do these organizations do? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the group that basically summarizes the science of our changing system, our changing climate, and it produces reports about every five years. They are not a group that does science, so they're reviewing the science and the published and reviewed papers that occurred from the last time they did the last study. So it's like updating the science that occurred 5 years previously. They're currently on the 7th assessment cycle, so it started in 2024. And this year, earlier this year, they chose the scientists and determined who was going to chair the panels. to produce the 3 reports that I've listed there. So there's a report on the physical basis of climate and how we've gotten the uncertainty of understanding how our climate changes. And the previous one was released in 2021. And then the second report is on adaptation, and that was released in 2022. And then the third is on mitigation. So how we can adapt to climate change, how the different countries can adapt to it, and how people are adapting and what can be done to improve that, and then how we can mitigate or reduce our carbon footprint around the globe, and what that leads to. There's also a summary report. After these 3 reports are done, they'll put together a summary, and that summary is the political document, if you will, that comes out of this, because while the reports themselves are written by scientists and all the information is scientific information that comes from well-researched issues, the summary is when the political leaders get together. For example, it would be like the head of NOAA, for example, might be the political person that comes to the meeting that approves the executive summary. And so the executive summary of these reports is, I think, a little more politically and nuanced than the individual reports themselves. That's probably my own opinion. Then there's some other special reports that this panel may produce. Recently, they produced one on global warming of 1.5 degrees C or 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit, and what happens if you go beyond that, what the consequences are. There's another one that was done just on the oceans and the cryosphere separately themselves. And then this year they're working on a special report on how climate change is affecting cities. So I would expect that one to be published sometime late next year or early 2027. So this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has these 3 working groups that I mentioned. So they have this overall structure that has this plenary, which is where the political type people attend and approves like the executive summary. But each one of these is then chaired by various countries. The current chair is from the UK, and there's vice chairs from Tanzania, Cuba, and Hungary. So they try to spread the work out across all continents and all countries so that there's a good representative of viewpoints from around the world. The working groups, I've listed the countries that the chairs come. Oops. So the report that's on the physical basis is chaired by France and China. And the second one on adaptation is from the Netherlands and Singapore. And then the third one is chaired by the US and Malaysia. The person who chairs the third group, Catherine Calvin, is part of an organization called the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, but she's based in Washington, D.C. But I do not know if she still has that role. It's still listed on the the panel's website, but because she's a federal employee and the state of the administration's work on climate has kind of stopped, I don't know if she still serves that role. So I'm waiting to see if there's an update to the website. Also, there's a person that's called a focal point rep from each country that helps choose the scientists that participate on these panels. And that person is no longer part of the federal government who's listed on the website. So I don't think he actually serves that role anymore. But there are U.S. scientists on these panels. They not necessarily have been nominated by the federal government, because I, as an approved NGO to the IPCC, can also nominate people to serve as one of the scientists. So there's quite a number of U.S. scientists that are part of these panels. And I expect that to be true. I don't expect that the science will change a whole lot. And because the U.S. doesn't have someone chairing a committee. So what about the second entity that deals with climate at the UN? The treaty itself, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So every year there's what's called the Conference of the Parties, or COPs, and when you read the news articles on this, they always talk about these COPs that happen yearly. I just, as an aside, I want to say that the Conference of the Parties are not unique to climate issues. There are treaties that deal with biodiversity, seabed mining, plastics, etc. And all of these different treaties have these Conference of the Parties, or COPs, that occur every so often. So even though when we think of COP, it's mostly about climate, this phrase, Conference of the Parties, is how the UN talks about the parties that have signed on to the treaties and their annual meetings to negotiate whatever issue that is. But for the climate work, this will be the 30th, I'm going to say year, but there's been some years that were skipped because of COVID. But it's the 30th time that they've met, and it will be held in Brazil this year, the second 2 weeks of November. Last year, the US election fell right in the middle of the COP. So that produced a lot of interesting conversations, shall we say, in Azerbaijan, where it was held. The League, because we're an approved, accredited observer to the convention, we can have a delegation of observers to go. And it's a formal process. We have to submit names, specific names, and we can submit a large number of names, and I do this. And then the UN looks across all the different NGOs and also understands the size of the venue where the conference is being held, and then allocates us a number of slots. And in recent years, the number of NGOs that are accredited has skyrocketed, and our number of slots has dramatically decreased. So at one point we sent 9 each week, so we had 18 that we could send. This year we have 2 that we can send each week, and last year we only had 1. So it just depends on the country, the year, how many NGOs are applying for slots, how they divvy things up. And this annual conference is about policy making, so there's negotiations going on, and how to fund that work, because there's a lot of funding that needs to happen to help developing countries achieve the climate goals. And then there's a lot of different side events. So the goal of the convention is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic climate interference with climate. And I put this slide up to just illustrate how just sort of how it's set up. So there's this overall treaty with a secretariat that's located in Bonn, Germany, and is part of the reason I don't have to be in New York, because I can just monitor. It would be the same for me to monitor things from New York as it is from Portland, Oregon. So it's the secretariat, and it's a large building, has a large number of employees, and in Bonn. And then there's these two subsidiary parts of it. One is a bureau that handles the implementation of the treaty itself. So the details of the treaty are negotiated by the member states, and then there's this body that helps to implement it. And then there's another body that deals with the science and technology issues that are associated with reducing our carbon footprint. For example, setting up a carbon market needs a lot of technology and systems, and keeping track of how much carbon we're putting into the atmosphere needs a lot of technology to help track those sorts of things and make sure things are working okay. So that's what that body is for. So the information from the other climate entity at the UN, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their information is then used by this science and subsidiary body. So there's that's where the connection happens. So the treaty falls under the General Assembly, and then the IPCC also falls under the Economic and Social Council. So there's two bits of the UN's large bureaucracy that are involved in the work of dealing with climate. But there's also a lot of other things that fall underneath these permanent entities of the UNFCCC. There's bodies that deal with the Paris Agreement itself. There's committees that deal with financing. There's one that deals with adaptation and the details of that sort of thing. And these groups that are underneath come and go with what's being discussed and how it's being implemented and how things are changing. So currently, during the negotiations, there's these 5 different areas that you'll see negotiators participate in. One is issues that are just dealt at the very high level of the COP. So it's the number after it is the number of years that they've met. And then there's the second one is the bit of the treaty that deals with the Kyoto Protocol. So in 1997, the negotiators set up the Kyoto Protocol, which is basically a carbon trading system to help guide the countries in reducing their carbon footprint. and it is slowly disappearing. So when the Paris Agreement is put fully in place, the bit that deals with the Kyoto Protocol will go away. So there were a lot of things wrong with the Kyoto Protocol. It didn't really work very well. There was carbon trading where they called double counting, because sometimes you'd say you're trading it here and also over here, and things weren't always done right, and there were issues basically with it. So they're trying to improve that then with the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015. So why do we call this the Kyoto Protocol and then the Paris Agreement? And the names get attached because that's where the conference of the parties were held the year that those things were decided. So if anything comes out of Brazil this year, it'll have a Balim something after it, the name of it. So the conference was in Paris in 2015, and so that's why we call it the Paris Agreement. And there's different issues that fall under the two formal subsidiary bodies. And if you notice, the number after those two bodies is, they're 63, so they've met twice as often as the overall convention. So they meet in June in Bonn, Germany, always, as well as at the convention. So the June meeting of the parties is basically to set the agenda and get some easy issues off the table before they have the big convention in whatever city is hosting it that year. So the Paris Agreement, I was just describe a little bit of how this thing works. A lot of it comes out of the politics from the U.S. that I'll mention in a second. So every 5 years, each country writes a report that is called the Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC, and this is a report that says my country will do X, Y, and Z to reduce my carbon footprint by year 2035, for example. So every 5 years, they are supposed to produce these reports. In between those 5 years, the convention produces what's called a global stocktake. And that's basically, they go around and try to figure out how much carbon we're still emitting to the atmosphere, how much we're correcting for. And this information is supposed to be used by the countries to guide them on their next iteration of their nationally determined contribution. So the thought is that if they see what they're doing now isn't that effective, they'll be more ambitious and do something maybe a little bit different the next 5 years. So this is an iterative thing that happens, all voluntary, because countries don't like to be told what to do. I mean, you're not ever going to have countries do that. So it's all voluntary. And this is the year that they're supposed to all be submitting their new NDC to reach getting to net zero emissions by 2050. And it's not, I mean, it is what it is, but we're not doing it fast enough for sure. So a lot of the work is to try to make the countries more ambitious this time in correcting the carbon footprint. So I thought I'd give an example of what these things are, these nationally determined contribution, and it's easiest for me to use the US as the example. So this year is when we're supposed to be submitting it, and the latest NDC that the US submitted was December of 2024 because they knew the result of the election and said, okay, we'll get this in. The next administration does what it does, but it's there. It's also guided by something called the Byrd-Hagel resolution. I think that's the wrong year. It's supposed to be 1987, I believe. And this is a resolution that Senator Byrd and Senator Hagel passed that said, unless all the countries, including developing countries, do the same thing, we shouldn't be signing on to these agreements. A lot of, this is somewhat difficult to explain. So there's this thing called Annex 1 countries, and I have to look at my notes to remember, they're the developed world, and they're defined by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD. So these are called the Annex 1 countries, and a lot of the negotiations say, well, the Annex 1 country or the developed world should be doing this, but the other countries don't need to follow these guidelines. The one country that is not an Annex 1 country and that fights being included is, I don't know if anyone knows this, it's China. So it's a big polluter, it's quite wealthy, but because these parties in the Annex 1 were defined some time ago, they don't fall into that categories, and they don't want to be. So the U.S.'s NDC has this in mind when it's developing its how it's going to reduce its carbon footprint. So in the latest NDC, the U.S. stated that they would reduce their emissions by 61 to 66% below the 2005 levels by 2035. And the way they say they're going to do it are regulation and if new legislation is required. And because of this resolution, we also don't ever participate in the carbon markets. So this is from the previous NDC that the U.S. had, but it's still valid. So there's various laws in place, the Clean Air Act, the Energy Policy Act, and then the Energy Independence and Security Act that can be used to address various ways to reduce our emissions. For example, fuel efficiency in cars, building sector emissions, etc. And so these regulations, which are now being gutted, and the League has been involved in trying to fight this, but it's probably tilting at windmills. These are the ways that you could reduce your carbon emissions in the NDC, and they list these things. So what goes on at these conferences every year. So there's two areas. One is the UN space, which is a space that only accredited individuals can go into. So when I mentioned that we have these delegates were allowed, those are accredited, so they can go into this UN space. And within that space, it's managed by the UN, the security is UN, it's a safe space, no matter what country you're in. The negotiations happen, and then there's also a lot of side events. And these side events are not only events that are organized by the UN, the NGOs can submit possible side events. The League has done that in the past. We were part of a side event that had to do with disability and the UN. It's climate treaty. But there's also, within this side event area, are large pavilions that are managed by countries or groups of organizations. So there might be a what they call a pavilion on the oceans, or one on agriculture that various international ag NGOs might set up. And within each of these, what they call pavilions are like small lecture spaces with panel discussions. So it's an opportunity for people that attend this, not only to see how the negotiations are done that can be quite dry and detailed, it's also a learning opportunity so that people can go to these, either the UN side events themselves or to events that individual countries have, and you can learn about what they're doing for climate change, or organizations like the farming area or something, or groups that are worried about glaciers or the cryosphere. And then outside of the UN space, there's a space called the Green Zone that's managed by the country, the host country. And this is a space that also has a lot of events going on and learning opportunities, which the general public can go to. So you're not, there's not a restriction on having to get prior approval to attend. And it also gets the community, the country, more involved in what's going on with it. So I expect in the green zone this year, because it's being held at the mouth of the Amazon, there'll be a lot of things related to making sure the Amazon is taken care of. So back to the negotiations, 198 entities is a very difficult number, a very large number to have negotiations, and you can't really negotiate with that many countries. So the countries, and this happens for all the different treaty type things, they have these groups of countries that form that play a dominant role in the negotiation space. For example, in the listed in bold, I've put some of the ones that are more vocal. Being vocal doesn't mean you always get your way, for sure, but you do get heard. So there's a group of member states that are from small islands. They've become increasingly vocal, and because it's been becoming more and more important that we do something about our climate, and they get up there in the negotiating space and tell people what's happening in their country. And so they have a spokesperson that represents all those entities. Then there's the Arab states. They're heavily involved when it comes to making sure there's a just transition, that the fossil fuel workers get treated correctly. They also fight a lot of the language that has to relate to gender and women's issues, unfortunately. And so there's a group, I don't know where they came up, called the like-minded group, which is some countries from around the globe, but I guess they at one point decided to get together and have this country group. And I'm not quite sure what the process is to get recognized as a country group, but they come and go. The U.S. is part of what's called the umbrella group, which is mostly developed countries. And then there's also EU. I didn't put EU up here, I forgot that, but there's also the EU as a country group itself. The U.S. normally just speaks for itself, and most of the countries within that umbrella group mostly speak just for themselves. On rare occasions, they'll speak as the umbrella group. So in the negotiating space, when this happens, the chair will allow speakers from these groups first to make their points because they're representing a large number of countries, so they'll make their points first. Then they'll allow individual countries to state their point of view on whatever topic is being discussed, or a little bit of text. You'd be amazed about how much discussion can go on about accepting a report from, say, the IPCC. It's, do you accept it willingly, or do you accept it with gratitude? And there'll be long discussions on this sort of thing. And it's like, really? Just accept it and with thanks. So after the individual countries do their thing, then if there is time, and each one of these negotiating sessions are like maybe an hour long, maybe 2 hours at the most, then the what's called the, I'm going to skip that one. The negotiating groups, the NGO groups can make their statements. And these are the current set of NGO groups. So rather than have the thousands and thousands of NGOs try to make statements, they've organized us into these constituency groups. And the League of Women Voters were members of both the environmental group and what's called the Women and Gender Constituency. For the most, when I go, I participate in the Women's and Gender Constituency because they're a much smaller group than the environmental one. You get your voice heard. You get really to build a lot of personal relationships with the groups. And so those are the groups that are how they're done. So there's farmers, there's a research group, there's a youth group, examples, and they each can then collectively make statements during the negotiations. So the issues that are of importance at this next meeting in November will be on finalizing the carbon market, which they're almost there. And then there's something called the new collective quantified goal that has to do with financing. And it's a way to say you should be spending this much money annually over the next, say, 5 years. And right now, what they agreed to last year was not nearly enough to do much of anything, even though it's like 300 billion annually. And this is contributions from both the private sector, which has been debated, and from the public sector. There's also some issues that deal with having a just transition for moving away from fossil fuels, some things about adaptation, and then the last is that all the countries have to submit these nationally determined contributions. And we'll see whether or not they're more ambitious than their last ones. So the money is always involved in these things. There's several different funds that are funded through the convention. The first one is the Global Environmental Facility, which is part of the UN's development program. It's not underneath the treaty. It's a separate thing, but there is some climate money as part of that. And then there's these three funds. There's a Green Climate Fund that's mostly a mitigation type fund, or it's also used for education type things and making sure people understand climate change in various countries. There's a fund for adaptation, and then there's this fund that was approved 2 years ago called the Loss and Damage Fund, and this is a fund that is supposed to help pay for damage that climate change has done to various countries, like flooding and islands disappearing, etc. So a lot of these funds fall under the World Bank. They're not part of the World Bank, but because the bank has a lot of expertise in funding things, they fall underneath that but they have an individual advisory committee and that the member states approve of, that they try to represent various parts of the earth. And this loss and damage fund is not well funded at all at this point. So finally, what's happening now? So the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Agreement in 2020. It takes a couple years, so you submit saying we're going to withdraw, and then it takes a couple years for it to happen. So we rejoined in 2021, so there wasn't really a period of time that we weren't part of it. In between 2017 and 2020, the U.S. did participate in negotiations. The people that were the negotiators, not the high-level people in the State Department or like Treasury, but they were the diplomats that do the grunt of the work for the State Department. And they have done it for years, and they're experts at this. So now, this year, so we've started the withdrawal from all parts of the UNFCCC, and the link there is for the actual executive order from the president. So there's 3 parts. Do you want to take a break? Is that it? Oh, okay. Well, I have a little bit more here, not much, but...
Let's finish it and then take Q&A after the break.
Okay. So this executive order says we withdraw from the Paris Agreement, we withdraw from signing any future pacts under the treaty. It doesn't say we withdraw from the treaty, but it does say we withdraw doing anything. And then the third is we'd withdraw all our financing that we've committed to. So basically, we're not involved. But because this process takes 2 years, will the U.S. show up in November? And I've read some news articles that I think it was the Energy Secretary suggested, yeah, we might show up. Like, oh no. So if the U.S. doesn't show up, they don't participate in the negotiations. They didn't show up for the IPCC thing, so they weren't part of that. They didn't show up in June at the pre-COP conference. So what happens, there may be less ambitious outcomes because the U.S. isn't pushing, it isn't countering some of the things that come from the Arab states or China. And then these other states will dominate. So China and India, the Arab states, and the only counter to that input is the European nations. But if the U.S. does show up, it could be harmful because they can set up roadblocks and make it more difficult because the treaty works by consensus. So if you have one country saying, no, that's it. So, and that's what happens a lot of times with like the Arab states. So you can make up your own mind which way the federal government should do. But the side events will have officials from the U.S., cities and states on different panels. There'll be, I suspect, some of the people that have negotiated previous treaties will be not representing the U.S. because they probably don't work for the U.S. anymore, and they'll be helping other countries with their statements and their expertise. I know there'll be some pavilions that in the UN space that are from the U.S. There's an organization called America is All In. This is Bloomberg's organization. And by the way, Bloomberg has funded a lot of the administrative bits of the climate work when the U.S. withdrew their funding. There's a U.S. Climate Alliance group. There's something called C4 Cities, which is cities that are committing to addressing climate change around the globe. So there'll be lots of people from the U.S. there and explaining how cities around in the U.S. are doing their bit for the atmosphere. And this is what happened during the previous, the first Trump administration. And then what about the other entity? Like I said before, the U.S. scientists are still on the teams to write the various reports. The reports are come from the science that's been reviewed and accepted in journals, so I don't expect too much different from what comes out of the reports. So just watch the news in November for some articles on what's happening and whether the U.S. is there or not. There's something called the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, which is a really good way to get unbiased information about what's happening day to day at the COP. So you can sign up to receive those bulletins in your email. And they sort of say what's happening in the negotiations, what's happening outside, what are the big issues. And it's a run by people who have attended the COPs as an NGO type people for a long time, and they're well informed about what goes on. So, thank you for your interest, and I guess we'll have a break.
we'll take some Q&A right now. Robin and Dr. Tokmakian is done with the presentation, so we'll take Q&A and then we will break early for the day.
Eric, do you have the microphone? Okay.
Hi, my name is Ann. Thank you for being here today. We're a large group of pretty active seniors. What can we do for the League of Women Voters or for the UN Association to help strengthen climate action in the world?
Well, participate in local things at your local league and make sure your local league is doing the things to put in place. I don't know if Marion County or Salem has a climate action plan. Huh? The city does? Oh, okay. Well, just support that and make sure it gets implemented. I mean, being in Oregon, we're pretty good about things in addressing climate issues. So other things that you could do is to make sure that the National League is addressing climate issues. The National League is currently responding to various proposed rule changes at the Clean Air Act. For example, there's a proposal about not counting how much emissions that the various entities are putting into the atmosphere. So that's a rule currently in the EPA regulations, and the current administration wants to get rid of it, and it probably will because it won't listen to the comments. But so supporting that kind of thing, also pushing states and cities to do their own carbon counting and making sure that if you have a polluting entity that it gets corrected in your local area, and making sure that that sort of thing can be put into a database and contributed internationally, and that would help because the federal government isn't going to do it. So that's a couple of ideas.
Hi, I'm also Ann. And in June, Rubio threw out a whole bunch of people out of the State Department because they were too woke. And I'm thinking those are the people we would have wanted to see in Balaam. Isn't it better that they don't go this year? That the State Department does not show up?
Oh, my personal opinion, it doesn't reflect anything from the league. My personal opinion is I hope they don't show up because they can cause trouble. I mean, in the first Trump administration, one year they showed up and they had a whole panel on clean fossil fuel. And luckily, there were a lot of angry young people who really made an effort to stop that panel from happening. It happened, but they were able to limit the number of people that went into the room and did some other advocacy things. That's the other thing that happens at these annual conferences is there's a huge number of NGOs, and they'll have advocacy and actions. So within the halls of the UN tries to control where you have your action so as not to disrupt too much of the negotiations. But the voices do get heard, and they can be quite powerful when you get a group of people, especially the young people that are very energetic and can do things.
This is Lee. I'm also a member of the League of Women Voters. On the first question, we have the state legislature meets here in Salem, so we should try to get on the mailing list of whatever the environmental committee is so we can track the legislation and maybe even give testimony from the intelligent people in our audience, number one. Number two, our state is notorious for a lot of wildfires. I'm wondering whether the United Nations or any of its entities are doing any kind of research on the prevention and mitigation of wildfires. Can you address that?
Well, the UN doesn't do any research itself, but various groups are doing it underneath, as part of something else. But there is discussions about wildfires at these negotiations and how it affects people and why that's one of the things we have to improve. There's a lot about forest preservation, how to increase our forest coverage. There's a whole financing effort that's associated with forests, so it's a central part of the discussions that go on.
Good, thank you.
Hi, I'm Bonnie. I'm curious, do we know who funds these misinformation campaigns to shape attitudes against climate change thinking and works? And then is the UN concerned about that, and are they doing anything? Is there any committee on making sure misinformation doesn't get further spread?
Well, I think we can all guess who funds some of the information that goes out. The UN, it doesn't try to control what individual countries say, because they're all sovereign nations and that's how the UN works. For example, when this event happened about fossil fuel and clean fuel, there was quite a bit of effort to counter that within that UN space, for example. For the science area, like the IPCC, that's all that information is based on scientifically reviewed papers over the past interim period of 5 years. And it's a broad set of scientists are writing those reports, and I think they have integrity. There's not a lot of bad science that goes into those reports. What you have to be careful about is reading the summary executive thing that comes out at the end and the specific wording, because that can be sort of framed a different way just to get consensus across the broad set of countries. But those science reports are well documented. They're not only written by scientists, they're reviewed by scientists. And if some bad science, if you had one scientific paper in there that was in some sort of obscure journal that counteracted everything else, for example, there was a report that came out of the Energy Department this year that was the basis for it to change some of the rules at the EPA. That paper had some rather odd papers cited. They were valid papers, but they were sort of taken out of context, and also it was just like one paper, and then they used that information, and there was no review of that report to say Well, there has been a review now, but it's been reviewed by people outside the government, not within it. And then the panel that wrote that paper has been disbanded, so they can't even comment on the people's comments on the paper. So that sort of thing isn't happening with the IPCC set of reports that come out. So I think you can be pretty sure that those reports are pretty good, and they may be underrepresenting the actual science, because science moves so fast compared to the stuff they're reviewing. Hope that helps. I don't know.
Hi, I'm Tom, and given the fact that the current regime has turned our country into a rogue nation, would it be possible, or is there any mechanism to allow individual states, particularly like Oregon, to send their own delegation to these COP conferences?
So they can't send. The UN is the way it's set up, they can't. And but they will be attending, and their voices will be heard, because in the halls of these conferences are a lot of conversations that go on. There'll be a lot of experts helping to provide that information. For example, the people from the officials from California and who have a lot of expertise in things related to climate, including carbon markets, they'll be helping to inform some of those negotiation spaces, because California has had this experience. Mm-hmm. So in that way, the states are represented, but the way the UN works formally, they can't. So
thank you.
Just to clarify, you say everybody knows who's funding these misinformation. Can you say who you think is the primary driver? Is it like China, the Arab states? Is it just Texas, as someone back here mentioned?
Yeah. I mean, we'll just say fossil fuel companies are doing it.
Internationally as well?
Well, because I think most fossil fuel companies are international, Chevron and There's some companies that have been trying to move towards renewables and aren't so vocal on things, but all has to do with money, of course, and so it affects things. I mean, I don't know if car companies are funding things, but I suppose they could be. But I think the last 4 years, I think car companies were moving in the right direction and realizing, I mean, I love my EV. I don't know why everybody doesn't, that is looking to buy a new car or use EV isn't out there buying one, because they make a lot of sense to me, but not from so much the environmental, but from the economic position, and just from the physics point of view, because I think they're a better use of physics. So.
Just a quick follow-up is the same thing happening in other countries? Are there big anti-climate change movements that took over the United States?
In Europe, there isn't. I mean, there's some small ones, but I think Europe is moving quickly. Even China is moving quickly. I mean, they have a lot of polluting coal plants, but I look at the U.S. is economically making a big mistake. They're going to lose out in the end. So, but I'm trying to think if you look at the oil countries, like Azerbaijan, where they had the last COP, there was a lot of effort to talk about oil and clean fuels and et cetera. But they're still trying to do a little bit on climate. So I don't know. It's hard to answer that question. I was going to say something else I'm thinking about. So they have these conferences all over the globe, and why last year did they decide to have it in Azerbaijan, a big oil country? A lot of people were asking. And it's like the countries themselves have to volunteer, but then there's a rota of which bit of the world, they've divided the world up into sections, so which bit of the world should host the next COP. And so it rotates around the globe. And they've tried recently not to always have it in the northern hemisphere. So they were supposed to have it in Chile one year, and then Chile had an uprising in Santiago, and so it got moved to Madrid. And then Fiji was the host one year, but it's such a small place that they didn't have the capacity, so it was held in Bonn, Germany, because that's where the UN climate work is based. And then next year, it may be in Australia, and as part of that, then some of the island states are co-hosting it. The other option is in Turkey, so they're trying to decide where it will be held. But they try to move it around and to get, so the ability for local people that can learn about it and participate. I mean, the other thing about, this isn't related to climate, but one other thing is that because of the funding that the UN has lost, because the US is cutting back a lot of the funding, some of the work that's now based in New York, and I don't know which bits, are going to be moving probably to places like Nairobi and Kenya. So, and also it costs a lot to live in New York City, so they're trying to reduce some of the costs. So, you know, the UN in the future may look a little bit different than what it is now. And some of the people of the UN Association may know more than me about that.
Yep. I guess that'll be it. Any more questions? And otherwise, we'll go ahead and break for the day. Oh, one more question? Absolutely.
I am not, so.
The question was, is she going to Brazil?
I'm
For the
not
next meeting.
going to Brazil. It's very expensive, used a lot of carbon. There were 4 other people that really wanted to go who hadn't been, and we only have 2 slots each week. And I can watch it virtually, and I know what I'm interested in, and so I pay most attention to the negotiations, and I can watch those virtually. You have to be approved to watch things virtually, so I can't give you all that access, but I wish I could. So there's a special platform for virtual participation, and so I'm not going this year.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tokmakian.